Tonight we step into a world ruled not by swords, but by rules. Rules that decided what you could wear, what you could eat, when you could speak, and when silence was the safest choice. In the medieval world, some rules claimed to protect society, some claimed to protect souls. But many existed for one reason, only control. You could be punished without fully understanding why, obey without knowing who truly benefited, and fear the rule more than the crime itself. The strangest part is this: the most powerful rules were never written down. They lived in tradition, habit, and unspoken expectation. Tonight we'll slowly uncover medieval rules that made no sense. Rules followed for centuries, without question, because questioning itself was dangerous. As the story unfolds, you may notice something unsettling. In medieval Europe, daily life was governed by a dense web of rules that often feel baffling today, a mixture of superstition, rigid hierarchy, religious anxiety, and attempts to control populations with very limited understanding of economics, medicine, or human behavior. Many of these rules were not written laws in the modern sense, but customs enforced by tradition, church authority, or the local lord. And breaking them could result in fines, public humiliation, or worse. For example, what people were allowed to wear was strictly regulated by sumptuary laws that dictated fabrics, colours, and even the length of shoes based on social class. A peasant wearing fur or silk could be punished not because it harmed anyone, but because clothing was seen as a visible marker of God, ordained social order, and blurring that line was considered dangerous. In some regions, even the width of a woman's veil or the number of buttons on a man's coat was legally restricted, while nobles themselves often ignored these laws entirely. Food rules were equally strange, especially during religious fasting periods, when eating meat was forbidden, but eating fish was allowed, leading to absurd classifications, where animals like beavers, whose tails looked fish, were declared fish, so they could be eaten without sin. Eggs, milk, and butter were sometimes banned during Lent, yet people found loopholes by inventing foods that technically complied with the rule while clearly violating its spirit. Medieval justice was another area where logic often gave way to ritual. Trials by ordeal required the accused to hold hot iron, plunge a hand into boiling water, or be thrown into a river, with the outcome interpreted as God's judgment if the wound healed cleanly, or if the person floated or sank in the correct way, they were declared innocent or guilty, regardless of evidence. This assumed divine intervention in every case, ignoring the obvious reality that physical outcomes depended on chance, health, or even how tightly a priest wrapped the bandages afterward. Animals too could be put on trial for crimes like killing a person or destroying crops, complete with lawyers and formal sentences, reflecting a worldview where moral responsibility was strangely extended to beasts, while humans were often denied rational investigation. Time itself was regulated in ways that feel nonsensical today. Bells determined when people worked, prayed, ate, or slept, and entire towns adjusted their daily rhythm according to church schedules rather than daylight or productivity. Missing Mass without an acceptable excuse could lead to fines or social exclusion, even if attending meant abandoning urgent work during harvest season. Marriage rules were especially confusing. as the Church recognized marriages based on mutual consent spoken aloud, even without witnesses, leading to endless disputes over whether a couple was truly married. At the same time, people could be forbidden to marry someone because they were related within several degrees of kinship, a calculation so complex that almost anyone could be declared too closely related if it was politically convenient. Hygiene and health were controlled by beliefs that now seem backwards. Bathing was sometimes discouraged because it was thought to open pores and allow disease to enter the body, while strong smells were believed to ward off illness, leading people to carry fragrant herbs during plagues. Medical rules were based on the theory of humours, so treatments aimed to balance blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, rather than cure actual causes, resulting in practices like bloodletting for almost every illness, even when it weakened the patient further. Town laws could also be strangely specific and irrational. In some cities, it was illegal to throw waste out of a window except at certain hours, and even then, one had to shout a warning phrase before dumping it onto the street below. Other places banned games, songs, or dances at particular times because authorities feared moral decay, while simultaneously tolerating public executions as a form of entertainment. Travel was heavily restricted. Serfs could not legally leave the land they were born on without permission, effectively binding them for life to a single estate. Not because they had committed a crime, but because their labour was considered the property of the Lord. Even hunting laws made little sense from a fairness perspective. Forests were reserved for nobles, and killing a deer to avoid starvation could result in brutal punishment, while nobles could hunt for sport without consequence. Punishments themselves were often symbolic rather than corrective. People could be forced to wear humiliating clothing, stand in public stocks, or carry objects representing their crime, all based on the belief that shame was a more powerful deterrent than rehabilitation. At the same time, serious crimes might be forgiven if committed by someone of high status, reinforcing a system where rules existed less to ensure justice and more to preserve hierarchy. Religious rules permeated every aspect of life, from prohibitions on working certain days to bans on laughter or loud behavior in sacred spaces. Even though medieval festivals could be wildly chaotic and indulgent when officially permitted, the contradiction between strict moral regulation and frequent sanctioned excess shows how inconsistent these rules really were. Many medieval laws also tried to control thoughts and intentions, not just actions, treating heresy, doubt, or nonconformity as crimes against God and society. People could be punished for beliefs that harmed no one, while systemic violence, poverty, and exploitation were accepted as the natural order. When viewed together, these medieval rules reveal a world trying desperately to impose order on uncertainty, fear, and limited knowledge, using authority and ritual instead of evidence or empathy. They often made little practical sense, contradicted one another, and were unevenly enforced. Yet they shaped everyday life so deeply that most people accepted them as inevitable. What feels absurd now once felt like stability then, reminding us that rules are not always born from reason, but from the anxieties and power structures of their time. Medieval society added layer upon layer of rules that tried to explain, control, or moralize every uncertainty of life, and many of them feel deeply irrational when read continuously. Even speech itself could be regulated in strange ways. In some towns, criticizing local officials or clergy was treated as a moral offense rather than political dissent, and repeating rumors could be punished as harshly as theft, not because the information was false, but because it threatened social order. Silence, meanwhile, was sometimes enforced in monasteries and even certain neighborhoods during specific hours, with the belief that quietness itself brought people closer to God, regardless of whether it caused distress or isolation. Markets operated under rigid price controls called just prices laws, which attempted to define the morally acceptable cost of goods, ignoring supply, demand, or scarcity. So a merchant could be punished for charging more during a famine, even if his own survival depended on it. At the same time, hoarding food could be both condemned as sinful and quietly practiced by elites who faced no consequences. Laws about truth were equally confusing. Swearing an oath on religious relics was considered absolute proof of honesty. So a convincing liar with social standing could easily overpower a truthful but poor accuser who lacked reputation. Women's behavior was controlled through an especially tangled set of expectations. In some places, a woman could be punished for dressing too attractively because it was believed she provoked sin in men, while elsewhere she could be punished for dressing too plainly because it suggested disrespect for her husband's status. Widows were sometimes forbidden from remarrying too quickly, not out of concern for emotional readiness, but because rapid remarriage threatened inheritance arrangements. Pregnancy carried its own odd rules. Cravings were taken as serious medical or spiritual signs, and denying them was believed to harm the unborn child, while miscarriages could lead to accusations of moral failure or divine punishment. Children were not exempt from absurd regulations either. Childhood was often treated as a short and incomplete state of adulthood, so children could be put to work early, punished harshly, or held morally responsible for actions they barely understood, yet at the same time were believed to be especially vulnerable to demons and evil influences, requiring protective charms and rituals. Education was restricted not by ability but by class and gender, with the assumption that teaching certain people to read would disrupt the social hierarchy or encourage sinful curiosity. Religious calendars created further contradictions. Dozens of holy days required abstaining from work, even during critical agricultural periods. And while breaking these rules could bring fines or public shaming, nobles frequently ignored them with little consequence. Confession rules added another layer of control. People were expected to confess sins regularly, but what counted as a sin could vary wildly depending on the priest, region, or current moral panic, making spiritual safety feel arbitrary and anxiety. Inducing fear of the supernatural shaped many rules that had no practical basis. It was believed that demons were more active at night, so being outdoors after dark without a reason could raise suspicion, and sudden illness or bad weather might lead to accusations of witchcraft, especially against socially isolated individuals. Witchcraft rules were especially illogical, as they relied on confessions extracted under pressure, and on evidence like strange marks on the skin. Medieval life continued to be wrapped in layers of regulations that tried to control not just behavior, but fate itself, often producing rules that contradicted everyday reality. Even laughter and joy could be suspicious. Excessive cheerfulness was sometimes associated with moral weakness or temptation, while sadness could be interpreted as piety, creating a culture where emotional expression was quietly policed. Music faced odd restrictions too. Certain instruments were banned in religious settings because they were linked to pagan rituals or bodily pleasure, yet the same instruments were encouraged during festivals, showing how morality shifted depending on context rather than principle. Names themselves could be regulated, as parents were pressured or even required to choose Christian names tied to saints, based on the belief that a name influenced destiny and spiritual protection. Dreams were taken seriously as divine messages or demonic tricks, so people could be judged for acting on dreams or ignoring them, depending on how authorities interpreted the outcome after the fact. Hospitality rules also made little sense in practice. Travelers were expected to be welcomed as potential messengers of God, but strangers were simultaneously feared as carriers of disease, spies, or evil spirits, leading to a culture that preached openness while practicing suspicion. Clothing laws extended beyond class into morality, with bright colors or fitted garments sometimes blamed for moral decline. While drab clothing was praised as virtuous even if it symbolized poverty and hardship, seasonal rules added further strain. Certain activities were only permitted at specific times of the year due to religious symbolism rather than practicality. So repairing tools, marrying, or even engaging in marital relations could be restricted during unlucky or holy periods. Economic life was shaped by guild regulations that dictated who could practice a trade, how many apprentices one could have, and even how a finished product should look, leaving little room for innovation. Breaking these rules could mean exile from the profession, not because the work was bad, but because it challenged tradition. Ironically, cheating within guilds was often tolerated if done quietly, and by influential members, reinforcing hypocrisy as a survival skill. The justice system extended into everyday accidents. If a person died because of a falling object, the object itself could be declared guilty and confiscated, reflecting a belief that misfortune had moral weight rather than random cause. Fire laws demanded constant vigilance, yet cities were built largely of wood, and when fires inevitably broke out, blame was often assigned based on rumor or social tension rather than evidence. Cleanliness rules conflicted with living conditions. People were fined for dirty streets while lacking proper waste systems, turning poverty itself into a punishable offense. Moral rules about charity also carried contradictions. Giving alms was praised as holy, but begging could be criminalized if authorities decided there were too many poor people, forcing the desperate to choose between hunger and punishment. Education rules discouraged questioning, as curiosity was often linked to heresy. Yet universities slowly emerged as centers of debate, creating tension between intellectual growth and obedience. Astrology and omens influenced legal and political decisions, with rulers delaying wars or marriages based on star readings, while ordinary people were punished for similar beliefs if they were labeled superstition rather than accepted astrology. Gender rules permeated every stage of life. Men were expected to display strength and authority even when circumstances made it impossible, while women were expected to be obedient yet held responsible for moral order within the household. Infertility was often blamed on women regardless of medical reality, and remedies involved rituals, pilgrimages, or charms rather than care. Rules around death extended into mourning. Grieving too loudly or too long could be criticized as lack of faith, while insufficient mourning was seen as cold or sinful. Even friendship and loyalty were regulated through oaths that bound people for life, sometimes forcing them into conflicts that no longer made sense, but could not be escaped without dishonor. In many ways, medieval rules created an environment where contradiction was normal, logic was secondary, and survival depended on reading social cues rather than written law. People learned which rules mattered, which could be bent, and which existed mainly to remind them of their place. From the outside, these rules appear absurd and oppressive. But within their historical context, they functioned as tools to manage fear, scarcity, and uncertainty in a world without modern science or social safety nets. Still, the sheer number of arbitrary, symbolic, and unequal regulations shows how easily authority can drift away from common sense when tradition, superstition, and power outweigh empathy and reason. Medieval rules extended even into the smallest, most personal corners of life, creating a sense that nothing was ever fully private or free from judgment. Eating itself could become a moral test. Gluttony was condemned as a deadly sin, yet famine was common, so people could be shamed for overeating one season and punished for stealing food the next. Table manners were moralized to an extreme degree, with rules about how one held bread, where one placed bones, or whether one licked fingers, all treated as reflections of inner virtue rather than simple habits. Even sleep was regulated by belief. Sleeping too long was considered laziness and sinful, while sleeping too little could be interpreted as devotion, regardless of physical exhaustion. Dreams during sleep were scrutinized as signs from God or the devil, and recounting a dream could raise suspicion if it conflicted with accepted doctrine. Rules about cleanliness were deeply contradictory. People were scolded for filth, while living among animals, refuse, and open sewage. And disease outbreaks were blamed on moral failure, rather than environment, leading to prayer and punishment instead of sanitation. Speech carried constant risk, as careless words could be interpreted as blasphemy or insult, even when spoken in frustration or grief. Jokes could cross invisible lines, turning humor into a punishable offense, while flattery toward the powerful was rewarded as loyalty. Silence, meanwhile, could be seen as either wisdom or guilt, depending entirely on who was watching. Hospitality customs forced households to offer food and shelter, even when resources were scarce. Yet refusing a guest could damage one's reputation for years, creating pressure to perform generosity beyond one's means. At the same time, strangers were closely monitored, and a traveller without clear purpose or papers could be accused of vagrancy or crime simply for moving too freely. Marriage rules continued to trap people in illogical situations. A marriage declared valid by spoken consent could later be denied if it proved inconvenient to powerful families, while forced marriages were justified as necessary for social stability. Love was treated as dangerous, passion as sinful, and yet adultery by the powerful was often ignored or quietly accepted, revealing that morality bent easily around status. Parenthood came with its own burdensome expectations. Parents were blamed for children's misbehavior as evidence of spiritual failure. Yet children could also be punished as miniature adults, creating a cycle where responsibility was always placed somewhere convenient rather than fairly. Work rules were harsh and unforgiving. Labor was praised as virtuous, but resting too long invited suspicion, while working during forbidden times invited punishment, trapping people between exhaustion and fear. Apprenticeship systems could last many years, binding young people to masters who controlled their food, movement, and future prospects. Not always for training, but for cheap labor justified by tradition. Charity laws often punished the poor for being poor, distinguishing between the deserving and undeserving needy based on vague moral judgments rather than actual need. Those who failed to fit the ideal image of humility and gratitude could be denied help entirely. Religious fear intensified every rule as eternal punishment loomed behind everyday mistakes, making even minor infractions feel cosmically dangerous. Conflicting advice from priests, local customs, and personal survival instincts created constant anxiety, since doing the right thing depended on who interpreted it. Even nature was moralized. Failed crops, storms, or disease were explained as divine displeasure, leading communities to impose stricter rules and punishments instead of addressing real causes. In this way, rules multiplied in response to fear rather than effectiveness, creating a self-reinforcing system where suffering justified control and control justified further suffering. Over generations, these rules became so embedded that questioning them felt unthinkable, and compliance was mistaken for virtue. To a modern reader, the sheer density of these irrational, symbolic, and unevenly enforced rules feels overwhelming. Yet for medieval people, they formed the invisible structure of reality itself. What made no sense in practice made emotional sense in a world desperate for meaning, order, and reassurance, even when that order came at the cost of fairness, logic, and human dignity. As medieval societies aged, rules did not simplify, they accumulated like sediment, each generation adding new expectations without removing the old ones. Fear of dishonor became a powerful invisible law. Reputation mattered so much that a single accusation, even without proof, could destroy a family for generations. Yet there were few protections. Medieval rule making also revealed a deep obsession with controlling chance, as if randomness itself were a moral threat. Dice games, cards, and gambling were often banned or heavily restricted, not because they ruined lives, though they sometimes did, but because they symbolized surrender to luck rather than God's will. Yet the same authorities who condemned gambling frequently relied on lotteries, random draws, or divination to make decisions when no clear answer existed. Fate was rejected in theory, but embraced in practice whenever it served power. Weather rituals followed similar logic. Communities held mandatory processions or prayers to end droughts or storms, and failure of these rituals often resulted in stricter religious enforcement rather than questioning the belief itself. Nature was expected to obey rules just as people did, and when it didn't, humans were blamed. Language rules were another subtle form of control. Speaking the wrong dialect, accent, or language could mark someone as suspicious or inferior, even within the same region. Latin dominated law and religion, not because it was practical, but because it preserved authority by keeping knowledge inaccessible. Ordinary people were expected to obey laws they could not read, interpreted by officials who could bend meanings at will. Illiteracy was treated as normal, yet mistakes born from it were punished as disobedience. Writing something down did not guarantee truth either. Documents were trusted more than living testimony, even when forged, because paper carried symbolic authority Rules about property ownership bordered on the surreal. Land technically belonged to the Lord, the Crown, or God, depending on context, meaning people could farm the same land for generations and still be removed without warning. Improvements made by peasants, wells, fences, homes, were rarely recognized as ownership, reinforcing the idea that effort did not create rights. Taxes were often inconsistent and arbitrary, changing according to a ruler's needs rather than fairness, and refusal to pay could be framed as moral rebellion rather than economic survival. Even tools could be regulated. In some places, carrying certain knives or weapons was illegal for commoners, while nobles carried them openly, turning self-defense into a class privilege. Rules around sexuality were among the most contradictory. Desire was portrayed as sinful and dangerous. Yet marriage was encouraged early, and often for economic stability. Marital sex was permitted only under specific conditions, times, and intentions, while lack of desire within marriage could also be criticized as unnatural. Celibacy was praised as holy for clergy, yet sexual misconduct among clergy was widespread and frequently ignored, undermining the very rules meant to uphold morality. Same-sex relationships were condemned without clear understanding, often lumped together with unrelated behaviors under vague moral panic, while violence within heterosexual marriage was frequently tolerated as discipline. Public space was governed by invisible expectations. Where one stood during gatherings, how close one walked beside another, or whether one looked directly at someone of higher status, could all carry consequences. Eye contact could be seen as disrespect, honesty, or challenge depending on rank. Personal boundaries barely existed. Inspections of homes, bodies, or belongings could occur under religious or legal justification, while genuine privacy was considered suspicious. Even silence could be regulated. Remaining quiet during accusations might imply guilt, while speaking out could be labeled insolence. Festivals and carnivals exposed the absurdity of medieval rules most clearly. For brief periods, social hierarchies were symbolically inverted. Peasants mocked nobles, fools were crowned kings, and excess was tolerated or encouraged. These events did not weaken the system, they reinforced it by allowing controlled rebellion, after which strict order returned. Freedom was rationed like a resource, permitted only in ways that made continued obedience easier. The same society that punished small deviations allowed massive indulgence, proving that rules were not about consistency, but containment. Even moral responsibility could be outsourced to ritual. If something went wrong, communities looked for scapegoats, sometimes literally, believing that collective punishment or exclusion could cleanse shared guilt. Entire villages could be fined or shamed for the actions of a few, while individual suffering was dismissed as necessary for communal purity. Rules justified cruelty by reframing it as protection. Compassion was praised in sermons, but restricted in practice, often overridden by fear of setting a precedent. What makes these medieval rules feel especially nonsensical today is not just their content, but their emotional weight. Every mistake carried cosmic consequences. Every rule carried spiritual risk. Life became a careful performance, shaped less by intention than by appearances and interpretations. People learned to survive by blending in, repeating rituals, and avoiding attention, not by questioning or improving systems. Logic mattered far less than conformity. In the end, medieval rules created a world where order was valued above well-being, explanation above solution, and authority above truth. They gave structure to chaos, but at the cost of reason. Looking back, it becomes clear that many of these rules existed not because they worked, but because they made people feel that someone human or divine was in control. And when control feels more comforting than understanding, even the most irrational rules can survive for centuries, unquestioned, enforced, and painfully real to those who lived under them. Medieval rule systems also reached into how people interpreted success and failure, often turning ordinary outcomes into moral judgments. Prosperity was seen as a sign of divine favor, yet excessive wealth was condemned as sinful greed, forcing people to perform humility even while benefiting from inequality. A poor harvest might be blamed on a community's lack of faith, while a good harvest justified the authority of those already in power. This circular logic meant that outcomes always reinforced existing rules, never challenged them. If something worked, it proved the system was right. If it failed, it meant people had not followed it strictly enough. There was no room for neutral explanation. Rules about work carried similar contradictions. Labor was glorified as virtuous suffering. Yet certain kinds of work were stigmatized as dirty or morally suspect, regardless of necessity. Butchers, executioners, tanners, and gravediggers performed essential tasks, but were often socially excluded, forced to live on the edges of towns, and barred from full participation in religious life. Society depended on them while simultaneously treating them as impure. This moral labeling of labor had nothing to do with harm and everything to do with symbolism. Work that dealt with blood, death, or waste was seen as spiritually dangerous, even though everyone benefited from it. Authority figures were surrounded by rules that made them appear both human and untouchable. Kings were believed to rule by divine right, meaning obedience to them was obedience to God. Yet they were also expected to perform humility rituals to show they were not gods themselves. If a ruler failed, it was blamed on bad advisors, fate, or divine testing, rarely on the system that gave them power. Rebellion against unjust rule was framed as sin, even when rulers broke the same moral laws they enforced. Loyalty was demanded upward, while accountability downward was almost non-existent. Rules around punishment extended beyond individuals into families. A person's crime could stain their relatives, limiting marriage prospects, careers, and social standing for generations. Guilt was treated as contagious, while innocence offered little protection. This collective responsibility discouraged dissent, as one person's actions could destroy an entire household. Fear of shame became a stronger control mechanism than fear of law itself. People learned to self-police, not because they believed rules were fair, but because the cost of non-compliance was too high. Even kindness could be regulated. Helping someone the wrong way, outside approved channels, or without religious framing, could be criticized as pride or disobedience. Acts of mercy had to follow rules to count as virtuous, turning compassion into a performance rather than a response to suffering. Forgiveness was encouraged in theory, but discouraged in practice if it threatened authority or order. Letting go of grievance was considered spiritually admirable, yet legally dangerous, as unresolved disputes could resurface later and be judged as weakness. Time perception itself was moralized. Waiting patiently was praised as virtue. While urgency could be interpreted as greed or lack of faith, people suffering injustice were told to endure rather than resist, promised reward in the afterlife instead of relief in the present. This transformed delay into a moral demand, protecting systems that benefited from slow change. Hope was redirected away from the material world, making inequality easier to justify. Rules also shaped how people imagined the future. Innovation was often treated with suspicion because it challenged tradition, which was equated with wisdom. New tools, ideas, or methods were sometimes rejected simply because ancestors had not used them. Progress required permission, and permission required conformity. Change that came from authority was praised as reform, while change from below was condemned as rebellion. This double standard kept power centralized and creativity constrained. Ultimately, medieval rules did not fail because they were illogical. They failed because they were designed for stability. Medieval rules also shaped how people understood truth, often replacing investigation with authority. A statement was considered true not because it could be proven, but because of who said it. A noble's word carried more weight than a dozen peasants' testimonies, and a priest's interpretation could override lived experience entirely. This created a world where truth flowed downward from power rather than upward from reality. If an event contradicted doctrine, the event was reinterpreted, not the belief. People learned that accuracy mattered less than alignment, and survival depended on agreeing with the accepted version of reality. Disagreement itself could be framed as moral failure, making conformity safer than honesty. Rules around fear were especially revealing. Fear was not something to be reduced, but something to be directed. Fear of God, fear of shame, fear of punishment, fear of exclusion. These were cultivated deliberately because they kept people obedient. Courage was praised in battle, but discouraged in everyday life if it meant questioning authority. Standing out invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited danger. As a result, caution became a virtue even when it meant accepting injustice. People learned to live small lives, not because they lacked imagination, but because imagination carried risk. Even the idea of fairness was distorted by rule culture. Equal treatment was not the goal. Appropriate treatment, according to status, was. Justice was not blind but hierarchical, designed to preserve existing roles. A punishment that seemed excessive to modern eyes was considered fair if it reinforced social order. Mercy was risky because it blurred boundaries. Rules existed to remind people where they stood, not to protect them from harm. Stability mattered more than dignity. Rules also governed how people interpreted suffering in others. Empathy was constrained by belief. If someone suffered, it was often assumed they deserved it, either because of personal sin or ancestral wrongdoing. This belief protected observers from moral obligation. Helping too much could even be suspicious, suggesting sympathy with wrongdoing or defiance of divine will. Compassion had limits, carefully fenced by doctrine and custom. Pain was normalized, and endurance was praised more than relief. Rules about movement and space further limited freedom. Roads were dangerous not just because of bandits, but because travel itself invited suspicion. Being in the wrong place without clear justification could make someone a criminal. Borders were less about geography and more about permission. Movement required explanation, and explanation required authority. Staying put was safer than seeking opportunity elsewhere, even if staying meant poverty. Even memory was regulated. History was shaped by those who recorded it, and records served power more than truth. Events that reflected badly on rulers or institutions could disappear from official memory, while minor acts of disobedience could be preserved as warnings. Forgetting became a tool, just as remembering was. Rules determined which stories survived and which were erased. People lived inside narratives they did not control. The weight of these rules accumulated psychologically. Anxiety became normal. People learned to monitor their thoughts, words, posture, and even facial expressions. Self-surveillance replaced external enforcement. The most effective rules were the ones no one had to enforce anymore, because people enforced them on themselves. Fear settled into habit. Obedience became instinct. What makes these medieval rules feel so senseless now is not only that they lacked evidence, but that they demanded emotional loyalty. People were not just expected to follow rules, but to believe in them to defend them, and to internalize their logic, even when it harmed them. Questioning was dangerous, not because it caused harm, but because it threatened the fragile illusion of order. In the end, medieval rules reveal something timeless and unsettling. Rules do not have to make sense to survive. They only need to feel necessary. When fear is high, knowledge is limited, and power is unequal, rules become stories people tell themselves to explain suffering and justify control. And once those stories take root, they can govern entire civilizations for centuries, shaping lives not through reason, but through belief, habit, and silence. Medieval rules went even further by regulating hope itself, quietly teaching people what they were allowed to expect from life. Aspiration beyond one station was treated as arrogance rather than ambition. And dreaming of change could be interpreted as ingratitude toward God's plan. People were encouraged to accept their position as fixed, not temporary, and stories of sudden rise or transformation were framed as miracles rather than possibilities, reinforcing the idea that improvement required divine intervention, not human effort. This mindset made inequality feel natural and resistance feel pointless. Even when rules clearly caused suffering, enduring that suffering was praised as proof of moral strength, while seeking relief could be criticized as weakness or lack of faith. Rules also shaped how people understood responsibility for harm. When systems failed, blame was redirected onto individuals or abstract moral causes rather than structures. A starving family was not evidence of economic imbalance, but of laziness, sin, or divine testing. A corrupt official was treated as an exception rather than a symptom. This constant redirection protected institutions from scrutiny and made reform seem unnecessary or dangerous. Rules were not evaluated by their outcomes, but by their intentions, and intentions were always assumed to be pure if they came from authority. Even love and friendship were filtered through obligation and suspicion. Close bonds outside approved structures could be viewed as threatening, especially if they crossed class lines or challenged loyalty to family lord or church. Emotional independence was risky because it created alternative sources of meaning. Loyalty was meant to flow upward, not outward. Friendships that became too strong could be accused of conspiracy, favoritism, or moral corruption, teaching people to keep relationships shallow or carefully performative. Rules around aging and legacy further exposed the system's contradictions. Elders were praised as wise yet expected to surrender authority the moment they became inconvenient. Their past service did not guarantee future care. Memory of contribution faded quickly once productivity declined. At the same time, tradition was revered precisely because it was old, creating a paradox where age was valued in abstract but neglected in practice. The past was honored more than the people who had lived it. The constant presence of rules also changed how people understood choice. Many decisions were framed not as choices at all, but as obligations. Obedience became default, and deviation required justification. Over time, people stopped asking whether something was right or wrong, and asked instead whether it was allowed. Moral reasoning narrowed into rule following. This did not eliminate guilt. It intensified it because guilt could exist even without harm, simply for breaking form or expectation. Perhaps most striking is how these rules trained people to tolerate inconsistency. Contradictions were not seen as flaws, but as mysteries. If two rules conflicted, it was assumed that the fault lay in human misunderstanding, not in the rules themselves. This made the system immune to critique. Logic could not defeat belief, because belief did not require logic. Authority filled the gaps where reason might have entered. Over generations, this produced a culture skilled at survival but starved of agency. People learned to endure, adapt, and comply, often with remarkable resilience, but rarely with the power to reshape their conditions. The rules did not collapse because they were irrational. They endured because they were emotionally persuasive. They offered explanations when answers were scarce, structure when life was chaotic, and certainty when uncertainty was terrifying. Seen as a whole, medieval rules that made no sense were not random or accidental. They were expressions of fear, hierarchy, and limited knowledge woven into daily life until they felt natural. They shaped how people thought, felt, hoped, and endured. And while modern societies like to believe they have moved beyond such thinking, the medieval world remains a reminder of how easily rules can replace reason, how quickly control can masquerade as order, and how long systems can survive even when they quietly work against the very people they claim to protect. Medieval rules also dictated how people interpreted obedience itself, turning compliance into a moral identity rather than a practical choice. A good person was not defined by kindness or fairness, but by visible adherence to expectations, attending rituals, following dress codes, speaking the right phrases, and showing deference at the right moments. Someone who quietly followed harmful rules could be praised, while someone who broke a rule for compassionate reasons could be condemned. This inverted moral logic trained people to value appearance over impact. Doing harm within the rules felt safer than doing good outside them. Rules surrounding authority figures created an illusion of inevitability. Lords, clergy, and officials were portrayed not merely as leaders, but as necessary parts of a divinely ordered universe. Questioning them was equated with questioning reality itself. If authority caused harm, The harm was reframed as unfortunate but necessary, or as punishment deserved by those affected. This framing removed urgency for change. Suffering was normalized, even romanticized as a spiritual trial rather than a solvable problem. Medieval rules also trained people to distrust their own judgment. Personal intuition, lived experience, and even obvious cause and effect were often dismissed in favor of prescribed explanations. If something felt wrong but was permitted by custom, the feeling was treated as temptation or weakness. If something felt right but was forbidden, the feeling itself was suspect. Over time, this eroded confidence in individual reasoning. People learned to look outward, to priests, lords, traditions, and omens, for validation rather than inward decision. Making became an act of consultation, not reflection. And mistakes were framed as moral failures instead of learning opportunities. The relationship between rules and fear of change was especially tight. Stability was worshipped because instability meant danger. Any disruption, new tools, new ideas, new social arrangements, was evaluated not by potential benefit, but by the risk of upsetting the existing order. Even improvements that clearly reduced suffering could be resisted if they challenged tradition. Familiar hardship was safer than unfamiliar relief. This created a world where stagnation felt virtuous and curiosity felt reckless. Rules preserved the past not because it worked well, but because it was known. Rules also reshaped how people understood consent. Obedience was assumed, not negotiated. Authority did not need approval, it required submission. Many obligations, work, marriage, loyalty, service, were treated as natural facts of life rather than agreements. Saying no was rarely framed as a valid choice. Instead, refusal was labeled rebellion, ingratitude, or sin. This made power invisible because it appeared inevitable. When rules are presented as nature, resisting them feels as pointless as resisting gravity. Social roles became moral identities. A person was not just poor, they were meant to be poor. A person was not just powerful, they were meant to rule. Rules reinforced these identities by rewarding conformity and punishing deviation. Trying to step outside one's role was treated as arrogance or disorder, even when the role itself caused harm. This kept society rigid, with very few paths for transformation. Exceptional cases were treated as anomalies, not reasons to rethink the system. Even punishment was shaped more by symbolism than by prevention. The goal was not to reduce future harm, but to restore a sense of moral balance. Pain was believed to cleanse, humiliation to instruct, and suffering to correct the soul. Whether these outcomes actually occurred was secondary. What mattered was that punishment looked meaningful. This allowed cruelty to be reframed as care and violence as responsibility. The spectacle of punishment reassured observers that order still existed, even when it failed to make life safer. Rules also encouraged selective blindness. People learned when not to see. Injustice committed by authority could be overlooked as unfortunate necessity. Hypocrisy could be ignored if acknowledging it threatened stability. This was not always conscious dishonesty. It was survival adaptation, seeing too clearly created moral conflict with no safe outlet. Not seeing became easier. Over time, this selective blindness hardened into custom, and silence became cooperation. The cumulative effect of all this was a narrowing of possibility. Life paths were fewer, acceptable emotions were fewer, safe thoughts were fewer. People did not lack intelligence or creativity, they lacked permission. Rules defined the edges of imagination. Even rebellion often followed familiar patterns, aiming to replace one authority with another, rather than questioning the structure itself. The idea that rules could be fundamentally redesigned was almost unthinkable. What makes these medieval rules feel especially haunting is how familiar the pattern still feels. The language changes, the justifications evolve, but the mechanics remain recognizable. Rules defended because they preserve order, suffering justified because it has meaning, obedience praised as virtue, and questioning framed as danger. The medieval world reminds us that rules do not need to be reasonable to be powerful. They only need to be woven tightly enough into fear, identity, and belief. In the end, medieval rules that made no sense were not simply mistakes of the past. They were human responses to uncertainty, scarcity, and fear, elevated into systems of control. They show how easily people can be taught to endure rather than improve, to explain rather than fix, to obey rather than understand. And they serve as a quiet warning that whenever rules are valued more than people, tradition more than evidence, and order more than compassion, sense is often the first thing to be lost, even when everyone involved believes they are doing what is right. Medieval rules also blurred the boundary between survival and sin, turning basic human needs into moral tests. Hunger, desire for safety, rest, and companionship were all filtered through doctrine and custom, so satisfying a need could easily become a punishable act if done in the wrong way, at the wrong time, or without the right permission. Stealing bread to avoid starvation was a crime, yet allowing someone to starve was often seen as unfortunate but acceptable, because suffering was believed to have spiritual purpose. This created a harsh moral imbalance, where preserving rules mattered more than preserving life. Compassion was conditional, rationed by hierarchy and ritual, and often withdrawn the moment it conflicted with authority. Rules also reshaped how people understood luck and responsibility. Good fortune was interpreted as reward, bad fortune as warning. This meant that accidents were rarely treated as accidents. If someone was injured, fell ill, or lost property, the first question was not what happened, but why it happened in a moral sense. Someone somewhere must have failed. This mindset made empathy difficult, because helping too readily risked interfering with divine intention. Suffering had to be respected, even when it was preventable. As a result, many people learned to endure silently, believing that speaking out might only make things worse. The enforcement of rules was often unpredictable, which made them even more powerful. A rule might be ignored for years, and then suddenly enforced with brutal severity, not because circumstances had changed, but because enforcement itself was a reminder of authority. This unpredictability kept people anxious and cautious. One could never be sure which rule mattered most at any given moment. So the safest strategy was obedience across the board. Living carefully became more important than living fully. Rules also influenced how people interpreted success in moral terms. someone who navigated the system well, avoiding punishment, maintaining reputation, pleasing authorities, was seen as virtuous regardless of whether they caused harm along the way. Meanwhile, those who struggled were often blamed for their own failure to adapt. This rewarded manipulation and conformity over honesty and care. Cleverness became the art of surviving within the rules, not improving them. Moral worth slowly drifted away from actions and toward outcomes shaped by power. Even spiritual comfort was tightly regulated. Personal interpretations of faith were discouraged as they threatened uniformity. Belief had to look a certain way, sound a certain way, and be expressed at certain times. Too much devotion could be suspicious, just as too little devotion could be condemned. People learned to perform faith correctly rather than experience it sincerely. Ritual replaced reflection. Certainty replaced curiosity. The sheer weight of these rules shaped how people aged, loved, worked, and died. Life became a sequence of obligations rather than choices. Freedom was not something to be expanded, but something to be controlled. Many people never imagined alternatives because alternatives were not part of the mental landscape. Rules did not simply govern behavior. They governed imagination. What makes all of this especially striking is that many medieval people were deeply intelligent, resourceful, and emotionally complex. The problem was not lack of human capacity, but lack of structural permission. Rules narrowed what that capacity could safely become. They offered meaning, but at the cost of possibility. They explained suffering, but did not reduce it. They created order, but not justice. In that sense, medieval rules that made no sense were not failures of thinking, they were successes of control. They did exactly what they were designed to do: stabilize hierarchy, suppress uncertainty, and convert fear into obedience. They remind us that when societies prioritize control over care, explanation over improvement, and tradition over truth, rules can multiply endlessly while sense quietly disappears. Medieval rules also conditioned people to accept contradiction as a normal state of existence. A rule could demand humility while rewarding pride in the powerful preach equality before God, while enforcing radical inequality on earth, and condemn violence while celebrating it. When sanctioned by authority, these contradictions were not seen as problems to solve, but as mysteries to accept. Questioning them was treated as a lack of faith or loyalty. Over time, this taught people to compartmentalize their understanding of the world, holding opposing ideas without feeling the need to reconcile them. Emotional survival required learning when not to think too deeply. Rules shaped how people responded to injustice by teaching patience over protest. Endurance was framed as noble, resistance as dangerous. Even when wronged, individuals were encouraged to wait, pray, or suffer quietly rather than seek change. Justice was promised later, often in the afterlife, redirecting anger away from the present. This delayed accountability indefinitely. Medieval rules also shaped how people understood dignity, often stripping it away while claiming to protect it. Personal worth was tied less to humanity and more to obedience, lineage, and usefulness. A person's value could rise or fall overnight based on rumor, accusation, or shifting favor. Yet this instability was treated as natural. Public humiliation was normalized as corrective rather than cruel, teaching people that dignity was conditional and revocable. Being seen mattered more than being safe. Survival depended on maintaining appearances, even when reality collapsed underneath them. Rules about suffering went further by romanticizing pain. Hardship was praised as spiritually refining, turning misery into evidence of virtue. This belief discouraged improvement, because reducing suffering risked weakening moral character. Comfort became suspicious, relief became indulgent, and care became secondary to discipline. Instead of asking how to ease pain, society asked how to endure it better. This framing allowed unnecessary suffering to persist, while absolving those with power from responsibility to change conditions. Rules also trained people to accept delay as destiny. Promises of justice, reward, or peace were always pushed into the future. After repentance, after obedience, after death. This endless postponement created patience without progress. People learned to wait rather than demand, to hope rather than act. The future became a moral bargaining chip used to control the present. As long as meaning was promised later, suffering now could be justified. Even truth itself was shaped by repetition rather than evidence. A belief repeated often enough became unquestionable, especially when reinforced through ritual and authority. Contradictory experiences were ignored or reinterpreted. Over time, people learned to distrust their senses when they conflicted with accepted explanations. Reality became flexible, molded to fit doctrine. This made rules immune to falsification. If they failed, the failure belonged to people, not the system. Rules around power taught people to confuse dominance with legitimacy. Authority was respected not because it was fair, but because it was strong, old, and sanctified. Strength became proof of rightness. Those who resisted were framed as threats to order rather than victims of injustice. Power protected itself by defining opposition as chaos. Once that association was established, even harmful rules felt safer than uncertainty. The cumulative effect of all this was a society skilled at endurance but hostile to change. People learned to survive inside narrow boundaries, adapting emotionally and socially to constraints they could not escape. Innovation happened slowly, often disguised as tradition to avoid resistance. Progress, when it came, crept rather than surged. Rules shaped not only what people could do, but what they believed was possible. What makes these medieval rules especially haunting is how ordinary they became. They were not always enforced through violence, but through habit, expectation, and fear of standing out. Most people complied not because they agreed, but because compliance felt normal. Over time, abnormal cruelty became routine, and unreasonable demands became background noise. In the end, medieval rules that made no sense endured because they were woven into identity, morality, and survival. They offered certainty in a dangerous world, even when that certainty was false. They explained suffering without reducing it, justified hierarchy without questioning it, and preserved order without compassion. They remind us that systems do not need to be reasonable to last. They only need to be familiar, feared, and believed. Medieval rules also quietly taught people to confuse endurance with wisdom. The longer someone survived within the system, the more their silence was praised as understanding rather than exhaustion. Elders who advised patience were treated as sages, even when their advice simply reflected decades of adaptation to unfair conditions. Survival itself became proof that the rules worked, ignoring those who did not survive and therefore left no voice behind. This selective memory reinforced the belief that obedience was rewarded, even when it was merely tolerated. Rules reshaped how people understood failure in deeply personal ways. Falling ill, losing work, remaining unmarried, or failing to produce heirs could all be framed as moral shortcomings rather than circumstantial outcomes. This made misfortune isolating. Instead of solidarity, people often responded with judgment or distance, fearing that association with failure might invite divine or social punishment. Community existed, but compassion within it was conditional. Suffering became something to hide rather than share. The obsession with order also narrowed acceptable emotions. Anger at injustice was dangerous. Grief had to follow proper forms. Joy had to be modest. Love had to be controlled. Excessive emotion of any kind suggested instability, and instability threatened order. People learned emotional restraint not as self-mastery, but as self-protection. Expressing the wrong feeling at the wrong time could undo years of careful conformity. Emotional life became another space governed by invisible rules. Rules also distorted how people understood responsibility across generations. Children inherited not only land or debt, but reputation and blame. A family's past could determine its future regardless of present behavior. Redemption was possible in theory, but rare in practice. This made social mobility nearly impossible and reinforced the idea that destiny was fixed. People were born into stories they did not write and punished for chapters they never lived. Even language itself became shaped by fear. Words were chosen carefully, meanings softened, truths disguised. Directness was risky, ambiguity was safer. Over time, people became fluent in implication rather than expression. What mattered was not what was said, but how it might be interpreted. This constant calculation drained honesty from everyday life and replaced it with performance. Communication became a survival skill rather than a means of connection. Rules also encouraged a strange intimacy with punishment. Public penalties were meant to deter, but repeated exposure normalized cruelty. Watching others suffer became part of communal life. Children grew up seeing humiliation and pain framed as justice, shaping their understanding of authority from an early age. Compassion dulled not because people were heartless, but because constant exposure made cruelty feel inevitable. When harm is routine, outrage becomes exhausting. The reliance on ritual over reason further disconnected actions from outcomes. If a problem existed, the response was often symbolic rather than practical. More prayers, more restrictions, more punishment. When these measures failed, the conclusion was not that they were ineffective, but that they were insufficiently strict. Failure justified escalation. This feedback loop made rules multiply endlessly, each one claiming to fix the weakness of the last. Perhaps most quietly damaging was how rules limited the ability to imagine alternatives. When life is framed as unchangeable, even suffering becomes familiar. People stop asking why and focus on how long. Hope narrows, dreams shrink, possibility fades. The world becomes something to endure rather than shape. This was not because medieval people lacked imagination, but because imagination without permission was dangerous. What lingers most strongly in these rules is their emotional logic. They did not need to be sensible. They needed to feel stabilizing. In a world of disease, war, famine, and early death, certainty felt safer than fairness. Explanation felt better than improvement. Obedience felt less frightening than chaos. The rules promised that suffering had meaning, even if that meaning came at the cost of dignity. And so the system persisted. Not because it solved problems, but because it absorbed fear. Not because it protected people, but because it explained why protection was not guaranteed. Medieval rules that made no sense endured because they offered a narrative strong enough to carry unbearable realities. They taught people how to live inside limitation, how to survive without questioning, how to endure without demanding better. In that way, these rules stand as a reminder that the most powerful systems are not always the most rational ones. They are the ones that shape belief, identity, and expectation so completely that sense itself becomes optional. And once that happens, rules no longer need to make sense at all. They only need to remain unquestioned. Medieval rules also worked by shrinking the space between authority and inevitability until the two became indistinguishable. Laws, customs, and religious commands were presented not as human decisions, but as reflections of how the world naturally functioned. This framing removed the idea that rules could be changed at all. If something was ancient, it was assumed to be correct. If it was correct, it was assumed to be sacred. Age became evidence, longevity became proof. The fact that a rule had existed for generations mattered more than whether it caused harm. This way of thinking trained people to reinterpret injustice as imbalance rather than wrongdoing. If something felt unfair, it was believed that balance would eventually be restored through divine means, not human action. Justice became abstract and distant, removed from daily responsibility. This allowed people to witness cruelty without feeling obligated to intervene. Intervention itself could be seen as interference with a higher plan. Doing nothing became morally safer than doing something. Rules also fostered a deep fear of standing alone. Individual dissent was dangerous because protection came from belonging. Medieval rules also cultivated a deep mistrust of spontaneity. Acting without precedent, permission, or ritual framing was risky, even when the action was harmless or helpful. Spontaneous kindness could be misinterpreted as arrogance. Unplanned generosity might invite suspicion about motives. Even reacting naturally to emergencies could be judged harshly if it bypassed established procedures. Over time, people learned to hesitate before helping, to check customs before compassion. Instinct was treated as unreliable. Tradition was treated as safe. This hesitation slowed response to suffering and normalized delay as virtue. The system also trained people to confuse complexity with wisdom. Rules became so intricate that navigating them successfully was seen as intelligence in itself. Knowing which customs to follow, which words to use, and which gestures to perform mattered more than understanding why they existed. Mastery of form replaced mastery of substance. This rewarded those who memorized expectations rather than those who questioned outcomes. Cleverness became compliance executed skillfully. Rules further shaped how people related to time by anchoring meaning in repetition. Cycles of prayer, labor, fasting, and celebration repeated endlessly, giving life a predictable rhythm. While this offered comfort, it also discouraged long-term thinking. The future looked like the past, slightly rearranged. Radical improvement felt unrealistic because it had no place in the cycle. Change that did not fit the rhythm felt disruptive rather than hopeful. The treatment of outsiders revealed another layer of irrationality. Strangers were often judged not by behavior, but by difference, accent, clothing, unfamiliar customs, or unknown origins could all trigger fear. Rules governing hospitality conflicted with rules governing suspicion, leaving communities oscillating between welcome and hostility. Protection extended inward. Danger was projected outward. This made scapegoating easy during times of crisis. When rules failed to prevent disaster, blame was redirected to those who did not fully belong. Rules also distorted moral accountability by fragmenting responsibility. Each person was responsible only for their role, not the outcome. If harm occurred, it was because someone else failed earlier in the chain. This made it possible for many people to participate in cruelty without feeling personally responsible. Obedience provided moral cover. I was following rules became a shield against conscience. Even acts of resistance were shaped by the rules they opposed. Rebellion often borrowed the language, symbols, and hierarchies of the existing system. Instead of questioning the structure of authority, rebels often sought to replace who held power. This limited how transformative resistance could be. The imagination of alternatives remained narrow, bounded by the very rules people sought to escape. The cumulative psychological effect was exhaustion disguised as stability. People adapted so thoroughly that stress became invisible. Fear became background noise. Anxiety became normal. When suffering is constant, it stops feeling urgent. Endurance becomes identity. The absence of collapse is mistaken for success. What is striking is how rarely these rules were designed to ask whether people were thriving. Survival was enough. Functioning was enough. Order was enough. Joy, fulfillment, and dignity were secondary concerns, tolerated only when they did not interfere with hierarchy or control. Life was something to manage, not enrich. And yet, within all this, people still laughed, loved, created, and cared, often in quiet, hidden ways that avoided attention. Humanity persisted not because of the rules, but in spite of them. Small acts of kindness, private defiance, and unrecorded compassion existed between the lines of official life. These moments mattered, but they were fragile, always at risk of being crushed by formality or suspicion. That fragility is what makes medieval rules that made no sense so haunting. They were not just illogical, they were heavy. They pressed down on daily life, until even imagining lighter alternatives felt dangerous. They shaped not only what people did, but what they dared to want. In the end, these rules remind us that societies do not always build systems to help people flourish. Often, they build systems to help people endure. And endurance, when mistaken for virtue, can justify almost anything. The medieval world shows how easily sense can be sacrificed when fear demands certainty, when authority demands obedience, and when tradition demands loyalty. It is a lesson written not in single laws, but in the overwhelming accumulation of rules, each one small, symbolic, and seemingly necessary, until sense itself quietly disappears beneath their weight. Medieval rules also altered how people perceived moral responsibility by separating intention from outcome. Good intentions mattered far less than proper form. A harmful action done within accepted custom could be excused, while a helpful action done outside it could be condemned. This taught people that morality was procedural rather than relational. What mattered was not who was helped or hurt, but whether the correct ritual, permission, or authority was involved. Over time, empathy weakened because it was no longer the standard by which actions were judged. Correctness replaced care. Rules also trained people to live under constant anticipation of judgment. Even when nothing was happening, people were preparing for scrutiny by neighbors, clergy, officials, or God. Life became a performance with no backstage. There was always an audience, even if unseen. This anticipation shaped behavior more powerfully than punishment itself. People learned to anticipate what might be criticized and avoid it preemptively. Freedom narrowed not through force, but through prediction. The system also normalized inequality by framing it as functional necessity. Each class was said to have its purpose, and imbalance was portrayed as harmony rather than injustice. Suffering at the bottom was explained as supporting stability at the top. This logic made exploitation feel reasonable. Those who benefited from inequality were reassured of their moral standing, while those harmed by it were told their hardship served a greater order. Questioning this arrangement was framed as selfishness rather than moral concern. Rules further blurred the line between discipline and punishment. Correction was often harsh, not because it was effective, but because it was visible. Sauvacy communicated seriousness. Mild responses were seen as weakness. This escalation normalized cruelty and made restraint seem irresponsible. Over time, punishment became less about behavior and more about signaling authority. The message mattered more than the result. Even forgiveness was constrained by rules. Letting go of grievances could be discouraged if it bypassed formal processes. Reconciliation required permission. Personal healing was secondary to institutional order. This kept conflicts alive longer than necessary and reinforced dependence on authority for resolution. Peace was something granted, not chosen. Rules also shaped how people understood their bodies. Bodies were treated as sites of discipline rather than experience. Physical needs were managed through restriction, routine, and moral judgment. Pain was expected. Pleasure was suspect. The body was something to control, not listen to. This disconnection made it easier to tolerate suffering and harder to recognize when harm was unnecessary. The weight of these expectations accumulated silently. People adapted so thoroughly that constraint felt normal. Many could not articulate what felt wrong because wrongness had no language outside the system. Discomfort became background. Fear became habit. Obedience became identity. What is especially striking is how rarely these rules invited reflection. They demanded compliance, not understanding. Obedience was praised even when it was blind. Thinking was tolerated only within narrow bounds. The system did not ask people to believe because belief was true. It asked them to believe because belief was safe. And yet, the system relied on people caring deeply about reputation, belonging, salvation, and meaning. Rules worked because they attached themselves to what people valued most. Fear alone was not enough. Identity did the rest. Once rules became entwined with who someone believed they were, resisting them felt like erasing oneself. This is why medieval rules that made no sense were so resilient. They were not simply imposed. They were internalized. They shaped instincts, expectations, and self-worth. They turned survival into virtue and silence into wisdom. They replaced the question, "Is this right?" with "Is this allowed?" and then made allowance feel like morality itself. In the end, the tragedy of these rules is not only the suffering they caused, but the imagination they constrained. Countless possibilities for kinder, fairer ways of living never emerged, because they were never permitted to be imagined. Sense was not lost in one moment. It was slowly crowded out by repetition, fear, and habit. The medieval world stands as a reminder that when rules multiply faster than understanding, when tradition outweighs compassion, and when order is valued more than people, meaning can survive while sense quietly disappears. And once sense is gone, rules no longer need to explain themselves. They only need to continue. Medieval rules also shaped how people related to uncertainty by treating it as a moral failure rather than a natural condition. Not knowing was dangerous, doubt was suspicious. Ambiguity had to be resolved quickly, even if the resolution made no sense. When answers were unavailable, rules supplied certainty through ritual, authority, or blame. Medieval rules also reshaped how people understood freedom by redefining it so narrowly that it barely existed at all. Freedom was not the ability to choose one's path, but the ability to fulfill one's assigned role without punishment. As long as someone stayed within their prescribed boundaries, they were considered free. Even if those boundaries were suffocating, this reframing made restriction feel like normalcy. People were not encouraged to ask what they wanted, only what was permitted. Desire itself became suspect. Something to discipline rather than explore. Rules further distorted the meaning of responsibility by tying it to obedience instead of outcome. A person could cause great harm and feel morally clean if they followed instructions, while someone who broke a rule to prevent suffering could be labeled dangerous. This separation allowed cruelty to function smoothly, because guilt was redirected away from action and onto form. Conscience slowly lost authority, replaced by compliance. Over time, people learned to silence inner conflict by deferring to rules. The constant presence of authority also trained people to anticipate punishment more than justice. When something went wrong, the instinct was not to seek fairness, but to minimize exposure. Admitting mistakes was risky. Transparency invited scrutiny. Secrecy became a survival tactic. This culture discouraged honesty and rewarded concealment, making problems fester beneath the surface, until they erupted in more damaging ways. Rules also shaped how people interpreted compassion. Caring too much could be interpreted as weakness or favoritism. Helping the wrong person could invite suspicion. Compassion had to be measured, cautious, and justified. This transformed kindness into calculation. Acts of care were weighed not only against need, but against risk. Over time, people learned to ration empathy, not because they lacked it, but because it was unsafe to express freely. Even justice was framed as something external and distant. Ordinary people were rarely empowered to resolve conflicts fairly. Authority intervened selectively, often too late or too harshly. This created a sense that justice was unpredictable and impersonal. People adapted by avoiding conflict altogether, or settling disputes quietly. Outside formal systems, the law existed, but it was not trusted, it was feared. Rules also created a strange relationship with truth, where accuracy mattered less than usefulness. A belief did not need to be correct, it needed to maintain order. If a story kept people obedient, it was valuable. If a fact caused unrest, it was dangerous. Over time, truth became a tool rather than a principle. This made sincerity risky and performance safer. The emotional consequences of living this way were profound. Constant self-monitoring produced chronic tension. People learned to read rooms, faces, and silences with intense sensitivity. Social intelligence became a survival skill. Yet this awareness came at a cost: exhaustion. When every interaction carries risk, rest becomes impossible. Peace exists only briefly, in moments when attention is elsewhere. Rules also shaped how people imagined goodness. Goodness was no longer about reducing harm or increasing well-being, but about fitting smoothly into expectations. A good person caused no disruption. A good life left no trace. This ideal rewarded invisibility. Those who suffered quietly were praised. Those who demanded change were feared. Moral worth was measured by how little trouble one caused. Perhaps most tragically, rules taught people to mistake endurance for meaning. Surviving hardship became a story of virtue. Pain was given narrative weight, even when it was pointless. This storytelling helped people cope, but it also trapped them. Once suffering is meaningful, relieving it can feel like betrayal of that meaning. Pain becomes protected. Over centuries, these patterns hardened into culture. People inherited not just rules, but ways of thinking shaped by those rules. Even when conditions slowly changed, the mindset constraint lingered long after necessity faded. Freedom, when it appeared, felt unfamiliar and dangerous. What makes medieval rules that made no sense so enduring is not that they were universally enforced, but that they were psychologically effective. They reduced uncertainty, distributed blame, and offered explanations for pain. They created order in a world that felt uncontrollable. Sense was sacrificed, but stability was gained. And that trade, sense for stability, is not unique to the medieval world. It is a recurring human choice. Whenever fear outweighs curiosity, whenever order is valued above care, whenever tradition is treated as proof, rules can multiply beyond reason. The medieval world simply shows us this process in its most concentrated form. In the end, these rules did not fail because they were irrational. They succeeded because they aligned with fear, habit, and identity. They shaped people who could endure almost anything as long as it was familiar. And that is the quiet warning they leave behind. when endurance becomes virtue and questioning becomes danger. Sense does not vanish loudly. It fades slowly until no one remembers it was ever there at all. Medieval rules also trained people to see restraint as morality and action as risk. Doing less was safer than doing more. Speaking less was safer than speaking honestly. Helping less was safer than helping boldly. Over time, caution became the highest virtue, not because it made life better, but because it made punishment less likely. People learned to survive by minimizing themselves, shrinking opinions, desires, and ambitions until they fit comfortably inside expectation. A quiet life was praised, not because it was fulfilling, but because it was invisible. Rules also distorted the relationship between cause and responsibility so deeply that systems escaped blame entirely. When suffering occurred, explanations moved upward toward abstract forces, God, fate, sin, destiny, rather than downward toward specific decisions or structures. This abstraction protected power. If no human cause could be named, no human correction was required. Problems became metaphysical instead of practical. Fixing them meant prayer, obedience, or repentance, not reform. In this way, rules functioned like insulation, absorbing shock without changing shape. The emotional cost of this arrangement accumulated slowly but relentlessly. People carried unspoken frustration, grief, and fear without language or outlet. Expression was dangerous. Protest was risky. Even naming pain could be interpreted as complaint or ingratitude. So emotions turned inward. Stress became illness. Anxiety became habit. Despair became private. The system did not need to crush people openly. It allowed them to erode quietly. Rules also redefined trust. Trust was no longer built through care or consistency, but through alignment with authority. Someone was trustworthy if they followed rules visibly, not if they acted justly. This made betrayal easier and kindness rarer. A rule-abiding person could cause harm without suspicion, while a compassionate rule breaker could be treated as dangerous. Trust shifted away from character and toward conformity. Even the idea of improvement became morally suspicious. Wanting better conditions could be interpreted as dissatisfaction with divine order. Complaints were framed as weakness of faith. Gratitude was demanded even in misery. This emotional framing discouraged progress by redefining contentment as virtue, regardless of circumstance. People learned to police their own expectations, lowering them until disappointment no longer appeared sinful. Rules also shaped how people interpreted memory. The past was idealized not because it was kinder, but because it was familiar. Hardships endured by ancestors were romanticized as proof of strength rather than evidence of injustice. This selective nostalgia made change feel like betrayal. If suffering had always existed, then suffering must be normal. The weight of tradition pressed down on the present, limiting what could be imagined for the future. The accumulation of rules created a strange moral fog where clarity was rare. Right and wrong were not obvious, they were procedural. Ethics became technical. A person could act with cruelty and feel righteous, or act with kindness and feel guilty. Moral intuition was overridden by instruction. Over time, people stopped trusting their instincts altogether. Conscience was outsourced. Perhaps the most damaging effect was how rules trained people to equate silence with peace. The absence of rebellion was taken as harmony. The lack of protest was treated as satisfaction. This misunderstanding allowed suffering to persist unseen. People endured quietly, and quiet endurance was mistaken for consent. Stability appeared stronger than it truly was, because discontent had no voice. And yet, despite all this, human warmth survived in the margins, in shared glances, whispered conversations, small acts of help done quietly and without record. These moments mattered, but they were fragile. They survived only because they stayed hidden from rule and ritual. Compassion had to move invisibly to survive. What makes medieval rules that made no sense so heavy is not just their irrationality, but their cumulative pressure. One rule alone might be tolerable. Thousands layered together became suffocating. Life was not controlled by a single law, but by an atmosphere, dense, watchful, and inescapable. Sense did not disappear suddenly. It was buried under repetition. In the end, these rules reveal something deeply human and deeply unsettling. People can adapt to almost anything. They can normalize contradiction, justify suffering, and internalize constraint if doing so offers predictability. Medieval society shows how order can exist without justice. Medieval rules also redefined what it meant to be seen. Visibility itself became dangerous. To be noticed was to be judged. To be judged was to be vulnerable. Standing out invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited risk. As a result, many people learned to blend into the background, to become unremarkable by design. Excellence could provoke envy. Difference could provoke suspicion, and uniqueness could provoke fear. Safety lived in sameness. Over time, individuality was softened, dulled, and hidden, not because people lacked personality, but because personality carried consequences. Rules further distorted how people experienced responsibility toward others. Moral duty often stopped at boundaries drawn by class, belief, or kinship. Helping someone outside one's approved circle could be questioned, discouraged, or punished. Compassion became selective, filtered through permission. This fractured social solidarity and made suffering easier to ignore. If someone was outside the circle of obligation, their pain could be explained away as fate, punishment, or divine will. Distance replaced empathy. Even error was moralized. Making a mistake was not treated as part of learning, but as evidence of inner failure. There was little room for experimentation or correction. Fear of being wrong discouraged initiative. People waited for instruction rather than acting. Creativity withered not because people lacked ideas, but because mistakes were dangerous. Trial and error gave way to repetition and imitation. Innovation became rare, not due to lack of intelligence, but due to lack of safety. Rules also reshaped how people interpreted authorities' failures. When leaders acted unjustly or incompetently, explanations bent to protect them. Advisors were blamed, enemies were accused, or divine testing was invoked. Authority itself remained unquestionable. This insulated power from reality. Leaders were corrected only by replacement, rarely by accountability. The system learned nothing from its own harm. The emotional landscape shaped by these rules was one of guarded endurance. People learned to hope quietly, to grieve privately, and to love cautiously. Public life demanded restraint. Private life carried fear of exposure. Trust was rationed. Vulnerability was selective. People lived divided lives, one for safety and one for survival. Rules also redefined the meaning of community. Community was not primarily about mutual care, but about mutual surveillance. Belonging meant being watched as much as being supported. Neighbors were witnesses as often as allies. This constant observation discouraged deviation and encouraged self-policing. People learned to correct themselves before others had to. The most effective control was invisible. The accumulation of these pressures shaped generations who were skilled at endurance, but unfamiliar with freedom. Freedom, when glimpsed, felt chaotic and unsafe. Rules provided rails along which life could move without constant decision. Making choice itself became exhausting. Predictability offered relief, even when it came at the cost of joy or dignity. What makes this all the more unsettling is that these systems were not sustained by cruelty alone. They were sustained by care twisted into control, by meaning substituted for relief, by explanation offered instead of solution. They gave people a way to survive emotionally, in a world where physical survival was uncertain. Sense was sacrificed, so that certainty could survive. And yet history shows that sense did eventually return, slowly and unevenly. Not because rules loosened willingly, but because reality forced reconsideration. Plagues, economic shifts, and social upheavals exposed the limits of symbolic order. When suffering exceeded explanation, people began to question. But for centuries before that breaking point, endurance was enough. That is why medieval rules that made no sense are so important to understand, not as curiosities, but as warnings. They show how easily rules can drift from protecting people to managing them, from guiding behavior to shaping belief, from offering stability to demanding silence. They reveal how systems can persist, not because they work, but because people adapt. In the end, the medieval world reminds us that sense does not disappear because people stop thinking. It disappears because thinking becomes unsafe. When fear outweighs curiosity, when obedience outweighs compassion, and when tradition outweighs evidence, rules no longer need to make sense. They only need to feel inevitable, and once inevitability takes root, even the most unreasonable rules can survive. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, patiently, generation after generation, until no one remembers that life could ever have been otherwise. Medieval rules also quietly reshaped how people understood choice by narrowing it until it almost vanished. Many decisions were framed as obligations so early in life that they never felt like decisions at all. One's occupation, marriage prospects, place of residence, and social role were often settled long before personal preference could form. When people acted within these limits, it was called duty. When they questioned them, it was called disorder. Over time, choice became something theoretical, spoken about in sermons and stories, but rarely experienced in practice. People learned to live inside decisions made for them and to reinterpret acceptance as consent. Rules also trained people to reinterpret fear as respect. Trembling before authority was not seen as intimidation, but as proper reverence. Discomfort was reframed as humility. Anxiety was reframed as moral awareness. This emotional relabeling made oppressive conditions feel spiritually productive. If fear could be called virtue, then eliminating fear risked eliminating virtue as well. Safety became morally ambiguous, while discomfort became proof of righteousness. The system further distorted how people understood fairness by disconnecting it from equality. Fairness did not mean equal treatment. It meant appropriate treatment according to rank. A punishment that destroyed a peasant's life could be considered fair if it reinforced hierarchy, while leniency toward the powerful could be justified as mercy or discretion. Justice became a performance of order, rather than a response to harm. Once fairness was defined this way, arguing against injustice became difficult, because the system claimed it was already being fair, just not equally. Rules also reshaped how people related to the future by limiting the horizon of expectation. Planning too far ahead could feel pointless or dangerous. Hope was allowed, but only in abstract or spiritual terms. Concrete hopes, better living conditions, fairer treatment, greater freedom, were often treated as unrealistic or sinful. This kept attention anchored to the present and the immediate demands of survival. Long-term change felt distant, hypothetical, and unsafe to imagine too clearly. Even the concept of improvement became suspect. Improving oneself was praised only when it aligned with obedience and humility. Self-betterment that challenged social boundaries could be condemned as pride. This created a paradox where growth was encouraged but capped. People were allowed to become better versions of what they already were, not something new. Transformation without permission was threatening. Rules also shaped how people processed injustice emotionally by encouraging resignation over outrage. Anger was dangerous because it could lead to action. Sorrow was safer because it led to endurance. The emotional vocabulary available to people was carefully weighted toward acceptance. Expressions of frustration were often redirected into prayer or self-examination, turning outward problems inward. This internalization reduced visible conflict, but increased invisible suffering. Over time, this emotional training produced a culture skilled at explanation, but poor at remedy. When harm occurred, there was always a story ready about sin, fate, testing, or order, but rarely a plan to reduce future harm. Stories filled the space where solutions might have lived. Meaning replaced method. Acceptance replaced change. Rules also influenced how people understood authority's mistakes. Errors were rarely framed as failures of judgment. Instead, they were reframed as mysteries, necessities, or consequences of human imperfection beneath divine structure. This framing protected authority from learning. If mistakes were inevitable or meaningful, there was no need to correct them. Systems remained static, not because they were perfect, but because imperfection was normalized. The sheer continuity of these rules created a powerful illusion of permanence. When something has always existed, it feels as though it must always exist. People mistook duration for destiny. The idea that rules were temporary arrangements faded, replaced by the belief that they were reflections of reality itself. Changing them felt like changing nature. What is perhaps most striking is how deeply these rules shaped identity. People did not simply follow rules, they became rule-shaped. Their sense of self, worth, and possibility was moulded around expectation. Even rebellion often stayed within familiar patterns, seeking different outcomes without questioning underlying assumptions. Freedom, when imagined at all, was imagined narrowly. Yet beneath all this, humanity endured. People still formed bonds, told stories, shared laughter, and offered quiet help. These acts mattered precisely because they existed outside formal rule. They were small, fragile, and easily erased, but they were real. They remind us that even in systems that make little sense, human sense survives in fragments. And that is the final weight of medieval rules that made no sense. Not that they erased humanity, but that they confined it. They allowed life to continue, but rarely to expand.